And I'm very happy to introduce the first speaker, who is Ivan Kassal from the University of Sydney, and will tell us about analog quantum simulation of chemical dynamics.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this great conference. So I'm dialing in from Australia, where it's Tuesday already. So I missed some of the earlier talks because I was sound asleep, but I will view them all on the recordings. Today I want to tell you about some recent work which has just arrived on a preprint, but also I'll tell you a few secret things which we're working on at the moment. And the title is Analog Quantum Simulation of Chemical Dynamics. Okay. And before I forget, I want to thank the people who did most of this work. So this is a large team effort. In my own theory group, there's Ryan McDonnell is the postdoc who's driven this work the hardest. There's also Claire Birch, who was an undergraduate, Alok Kumar, who is a visiting master's student from IIT Bombay. And this is also a collaboration with our experimental colleagues at the Quantum Control Laboratory run by Professor Michael Biersuk at the University of Sydney. And I want to thank these sponsors on the slide as well. The title of this talk is Analog Quantum Simulation of Chemical Dynamics, and the title of the conference is Useful Quantum Computation for Quantum Chemistry. And I suppose the one thing I want to convince you of today is that these are connected, right? That analog quantum simulation of chemical dynamics is likely to be a useful quantum computation for quantum chemistry. And so what I want to tell you about is a completely new approach to doing chemistry on quantum computers, and it's new in, well, it's distinguished from others in two ways. So the first is that it's about analog simulation. So most of the other talks you will have heard earlier today, and then the rest of this conference will have required universal quantum computers, digital quantum computers. I'll be talking about analog simulation, which is achievable with existing technology. And it'll also be about dynamics. So chemistry is very much a dynamical science, whereas a lot of algorithms that have been proposed on quantum computers have dealt with static properties of molecules. And so here we're looking at a very different problem, the change in time. The algorithm I'll tell you about is broadly applicable to all kinds of chemical systems. It can be extended to open quantum systems. You can easily measure chemically relevant observables. And all of these things combine to make it, I think, a plausible route to useful quantum computing for quantum chemistry. So the first thing I want to say is what is analog quantum simulation? Well, it's really just to model a complex system with a controllable system. And of course, we've been doing classical analog simulation for a long time. And in fact, we still do it. Before you fly an airplane, you first put a model in a wind tunnel. On a quantum version of this is that you want to map a desired Hamiltonian of the quantum system you want to study onto a controllable quantum system. And this has been used for chemistry. There has been a flurry of what could be called analog simulators for chemistry in the last few years. Some of them have focused on electronic structures, although very few. This one here from the Sirac and Zoller groups is the one that comes to mind. Most of the others have been some version of spectroscopy, vibrational structure, Frank-Condon spectra, such as the ones shown here on the right. So these are versions of boson sampling to sample spectra of molecules. And quantum advantage on analog simulators is already there. This is a paper from Chris Monroe's group in 2017, where they studied a particular type of dynamical phase transitions in Ising models of 53 trapped ions. It's not quite relevant for this talk, but the basic idea is that once you get to 53 spins, which is what they were able to do, it is not possible to predict on classical computers what this curve should look like. So you can see all of these other 8 spins, 12 spins, 16 spins. There's a theory curve, but here at the top end there isn't. So analog, and the other is dynamics. Now, chemistry is very much a dynamical science. And so here's a brief crash course of chemical reactions, which maybe you remember from high school. Here's a potential energy surface. So as a function of two different nuclear coordinates, Q1 and Q2. And what this surface shows you is the ground state electronic energy as a function of nuclear coordinates, as a function of the shape of the molecule. And this is the energy that you would calculate using the static electronic structure techniques. And a lot of chemistry is concerned about getting from reactants, which are usually a local minimum on a potential energy surface, to products, which are another minimum. And in organic chemistry textbooks and things like that, you will see curves like this, where you have reactants and products, and there's a transition state in the middle. And you're, for example, interested in how fast does the chemical reaction happen? How fast do you cross this barrier? Or which way does it go, right? So here there's only one choice from reactants to products, but sometimes a reactant could react in two different ways. And you want to know, am I going to get these products or the other ones? So this simple picture is useful in many cases, but in other cases, we get a picture like this, where there are two or more potential energy surfaces, here shown in orange and blue. And these are just different electronic states, again, as functions of two different nuclear coordinates, here shown as Q1 and Q2. And here I can have a wave packet, a nuclear wave packet on the excited surface, which could arrive there by photoexcitation. So this is an example from photochemistry. And then slide down the potential energy surface until it reaches a point here, shown here, where the two surfaces intersect. This is called a conical intersection, and they are ubiquitous in chemistry. And what's happening here is the breakdown of the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. So the Born-Oppenheimer approximation is the idea that you can separate nuclear and electronic dynamics. And when it breaks down, we call it non-adiabatic dynamics, because you can jump from one electronic state onto another. When you do that, you can have wave packets branching in different ways, and you might be interested in knowing how much of it crosses through the conical intersection, how much doesn't. Ultra-fast photochemistry, so basically what happens when molecules absorb light, very often requires this sort of dynamical quantum mechanical treatment of non-adiabatic dynamics. And this is, I would say, in some sense, the most difficult problem in computational chemistry, because it requires electronic structure, but also it requires the ability to do quantum dynamics on top of these potential energy surfaces. And once you get conical intersections or any sort of crossing between curves, now suddenly you have entanglement between the nuclear motion and the electronic states. On classical computers, generic algorithms for simulating dynamics like this are exponentially expensive. And so this really affords a new avenue for exploring classical quantum mechanical simulation algorithms. Let me just illustrate my favorite example of non-adiabatic chemical dynamics, and this happens in vision. This is a molecule called retinal, which sits inside a protein in your eye. When it is excited by light, it undergoes a conformational change. So instead of being bent like this, it ends up straightening out. And when it straightens out, it pushes on all of these proteins and causes a mechanical motion around the membrane, which then activates all the downstream signaling cascade. And this happens on an ultra-fast timescale, so around a picosecond. It is extremely fast, much faster than thermally activated chemical reactions. And it involves two potential energy surfaces shaped like this. You have a wave packet on the bottom of one of them. It is excited to the excited potential energy surface. It slides down, and it encounters a conical intersection over here, which allows it to rapidly move into what's labeled here isomer B, that is this extended trans molecule, which you can then detect with your eyes. So this happens on a picosecond timescale, and it is ultimately a mechanical process because the molecule stretches out and pushes on things, and that's how you see. The minimal model of sort of the hydrogen atom of this field is a molecule called pyrazine, shown here, and it is a minimal model because it has very simple potential energy surfaces, well, relatively simple for this field. And I'll use this as an example for showing you what I'm talking about, and to construct vibronic coupling Hamiltonians, which is how we are going to be framing this simulation. So if you do Born-Oppenheimer calculations in the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, you end up with adiabatic potential energy surfaces shown here. And if you're interested in doing dynamics on them, you can start with your wave packets. They can slide, they can get into conical intersections, and they can split, like I've already told you. But it turns out that these kinds of calculations are very difficult because at conical intersections, you get divergences in couplings, and things get very messy. So most of the time when chemists do calculations like this, instead of using adiabatic potential energy surfaces like the ones I've shown here, they tend to use diabatic, this should say diabatic potentials, which are smooth. They don't have any infinite couplings, and very often they're parabolas or something like that. And for small displacements like the ones you see in pyrazine, you can expand the Hamiltonian of the nuclear and electronic degrees of freedom in a Taylor series. And this leads to what are called vibronic coupling Hamiltonians, like the one I've shown here. So the Hamiltonian consists of the free nuclear motion along each of the vibrational modes. Here I've shown 2 vibrational modes, but you could have as many as you'd like. And then there are some terms, some operators, which cause couplings between different electronic states. So you can have transitions between electronic states M and N that depend on these parameters C and M. And C and M can either be a constant, but it can also have higher order terms which depend on the nuclear displacements. And so this is where you get the coupling between the nuclear motion and the electronic levels. For starters, I will focus on the lowest term here. We're just keeping the linear couplings. This is called a linear vibronic coupling model, but I'll get to the higher terms in a little bit. The idea here in linear vibronic coupling is that you have potential energy surfaces, which are parabolas, and then you have couplings between them, which depend on nuclear displacement. So depend on where on the parabola you are. And because you have parabolas, you have bosons. These are quantum oscillators. And the idea is really a simple one, is that if you have bosons in a quantum simulator, use them. The basic idea that I will try to illustrate today is that you can map harmonic motion of molecules, such as this vibration I'm showing here, onto some native bosons which exist in a variety of quantum architectures, such as here in trapped ions. You get the vibrations of the ions in the ion trap. We're calling, basically what you need for this kind of simulation is a qubit and bosons, which are controllable. So we're calling this a mixed qubit boson quantum simulator, or MQB, and all kinds of things fit into this: trapped ions, circuit QED, and so on. The advantage of using bosons is that if you try to simulate bosons on a digital quantum computer, you would get into trouble very quickly. First, because you would need many qubits to represent a single vibrational mode, which can have many false states which are accessible, but also because the kinds of operations that you need to, let's say, implement a raising or a lowering operator get very ugly if you do that on a qubit basis. So if you have bosons, use them, and especially in things like trapped ions, where most of the vibrational modes that exist are not used. They're if you're building a universal quantum computer out of trapped ions, usually you want to cool all the vibrations to ground state and hope that they don't do anything. But here we're saying use this quantum resource for the simulation. This is a figure from the paper, which I can already tell you, I can already show you the sorts of dramatic reductions in quantum resources that you need to simulate chemical dynamics. So here, for example, I'm showing, this is a logarithmic scale up here, classical memory that you might need to simulate a molecule with a certain number of vibrational modes. And these curves up here are the classical costs. The dashed orange line is it doesn't actually have a name. It's often called the conventional approach, which is basically just full dynamics. It's exponentially expensive. The red curve, or it's not a curve, this red approximation is the cost of what's the cutting edge chemical approach called MCTDH, multi-configuration time-dependent heart rate. It also scales exponentially badly in the worst case, but precise scaling depends on the system in question. The two solid lines here are digital algorithms that have been developed in the past, whereas our NQB approach is shown here with these lines here. So the solid line is for trapped ions, dashed line is for circuit quantum electrodynamics, and you can see that this here is the zoomed in version. We can do large number, in principle, you could do large number of modes with just very few trapped ions or very few circuit QED resonators, talking about, single digits numbers of quantum resources. Here's just an example of what this looks like to simulate the 2D linear vibronic coupling model of pyrazine using one single trapped ion. All right, so it's a complicated Hamiltonian, but it can be simulated with one trapped ion. This is a complicated figure, but it basically shows you what's in the Hamiltonian of the molecule. There's the vibrations, there's the energy difference between the electronic states, and then there's tuning and coupling modes, which tell you how these different vibrations couple to the electronic states. You can implement each of these Hamiltonian terms exactly on a trapped ion simulator. So the harmonic motion becomes the laser detuning off of the vibrations of the atoms. You can use an AC Stark shift to create energy differences, and you can use gates like the Molmer-Sorensen gate, which is usually used as an entanglement gate, but here you can use it to create couplings. And basically what you're doing here is you're shining extra lasers, here shown in pink. So the light matter interaction induces this sort of coupling Hamiltonian between the electronic states and the motion. Once you've done that, then you have all the ingredients necessary to do an analog simulation. And there's three steps. There's initialization, there's evolution, and there's measurement. To initialize things, you need to excite the atom to the trapped ion to an excited state, so it can evolve on the excited surface. Then you have these lasers, which are on during the simulation to create the electronic vibrational coupling. But then otherwise, you simply let the system evolve for the amount of time that you want. And at the end, you measure the observable that you're interested in, for example, the population in the higher lying state. And so you might get an output that looks like this inset here, where you're looking at the population of the excited electronic state as a function of time. So you run your simulation for a certain amount of time, then you make a measurement of the relevant observable, and you might have to repeat this a number of times in order to get the precision that you want. And this is the sort of thing that we're looking at, we're interested in, or chemists are interested in, the dynamics of, for example, the survival probability in the excited state as a function of time. An important feature here is that molecular timescales get mapped to simulator timescales. There is freedom here in slowing down the time evolution. So when I say these are ultra-fast processes, they're happening on femtosecond timescales, but here we can map them onto the timescales of, let's say, a trapped ion simulator, which is vibrating on millisecond timescale. So this corresponds to a slowing down by 10 orders of magnitude. And basically, we're watching the ultra-fast dynamics in extreme slow motion. And this allows the time resolution, which would be impractical or impossible with any kind of actual spectroscopic experiments in a chemistry lab. Now I've shown you examples of pyrazine, the two-dimensional linear vibronic coupling, and you might wonder, well, what's next? Can we go to larger molecules? And I will briefly survey four ways of enlarging this. One is, how do you add additional states or vibrational modes? I'll show you what's actually very important about is that we can do system-bath interactions, we can do higher order terms, not just linear, and we can do all kinds of interesting observables. So as far as additional states and modes go, you might think that you need an individual laser for every kind of interaction, which would be very expensive and extravagant, but you don't. Instead, you can use a Suzuki Trotter expansion, which is very familiar to all of you who are working in digital quantum computing. You can do it in analog quantum computing too. So instead of having two different lasers causing the light-matter interactions for two different interactions, you can use one laser and you can rapidly switch it from, pink, purple in a kind of trotterized, salami-sliced way to give you the dynamics that you're interested in. And of course, this converges. I think I'm a bit short on time, but if you have short enough time steps, as you expect in trotterization schemes, you end up with very accurate dynamics. And so chemically here, this would correspond to time steps of a little under a femtosecond to get good enough results. The second thing that I want to emphasize is the ability to do system-bath interactions. And this is important for two reasons. First is that most chemical reactions that chemists care about actually occur in the condensed phase. We care about reactions in solution, we also care about them in vacuum, but the ones that, when you're baking something, that chemical reaction is happening in an open quantum system. Now, non-adiabatic open system quantum dynamics is extremely rarely simulated today because it is so difficult. Because instead of keeping track of a wave function, you have to keep track of a density matrix. And so if the wave function simulation is complicated enough, then doing everything in Liouville space makes things that much worse. But on an analog simulator, there's really very little difference between open and closed system dynamics. And it turns out that you can, we discussed this in the paper in greater length, you can simulate weak system bath couplings by putting in suitable Lindblad operators. And in particular, if you add an additional laser, here shown in green, which acts as laser cooling, then you can, this is exactly the same as running your reaction at constant temperature or in contact with a constant temperature environment. So the experimental cost is very little, but the computational advantage is huge. And so instead of getting the kind of black curve that you see here, which is what happens in vacuum, you start getting these very interesting damping effects due to the presence of noise of different strengths. And you can tune the strength and the temperature by tuning the properties of the laser. I think I'm short on time, but we can do higher order terms. So I told you linear vibronic coupling. There are existing schemes for quadratic.
You're still fine with time.
So dispersive. Oh, am I? Okay. I think maybe my Australian clock is running fast.
We started a little bit late, so,
okay, so
10 minutes with questions.
Okay. Thank you. Excellent. All right. Then I'm good. So I told you about linear couplings, which are things like Molmer-Sorensen gates, but there's existing schemes for things like dispersive couplings, where you have couplings proportional to q squared, or mode mixing, where you have qj, qk. Now, in this field, vibronic coupling models are beyond quadratic, are very rarely constructed. It just becomes computationally expensive, and you don't learn all that much from them. So we're kind of able to cover a lot of vibronic coupling chemistry with this approach. Now, the one open question that I kind of want to highlight is the possibility of engineering more complicated anharmonic potentials directly, as opposed to through very complicated, let's say, light matter interactions. So for example, if you're interested in reactive scattering, where you have open reaction channels, so things can just keep on going in one direction, you can't really express that as small displacements on a potential energy surface. And for that, we're thinking about how to do it. We haven't solved this problem, but you can imagine solving it using surface traps where you can put kind of very complicated electric fields to simulate, open channels, or even using intrinsic nonlinearities in circuit QED or some other architecture that we haven't thought about. So if anyone has any ideas, do get in touch. And finally, I want to talk about interesting observables. So one thing I showed you before is the population on an excited state surface, but you can get all kinds of other interesting things. One is absorption spectrum, which is how molecules interact with radiation. And this is a bit complicated, but it turns out it can be obtained from these sorts. It's a Fourier transform of a dynamical, so time-dependent autocorrelation function. So what's the overlap of your wave function at time t with the initial wave function? And if you do the Fourier transform of that, you get the spectrum. These are simulations, but the point here is that this approach can give you much more accurate predictions than some existing analog simulation approaches focused on spectroscopy. So here we're not limited to the Frank-Condon principle. We're not limited to diabatic transitions. So this is fully non-adiabatic, fully dynamical. So there's really almost no approximations involved. And so the spectrum you get is a much more accurate one. All right, so I'm going to anticipate the question that I mentioned a few people have, and that's about errors. And error accumulation is the main weakness of all analog simulation, whether it's classical or quantum, and this is, in classical simulation has been known forever. I want to say, and we don't have a full theory of errors in quantum simulation. So I want to make a few remarks. The first is that in particular, for trapped ion systems, the motional coherence times can be as much as 10 milliseconds. And depending on how much you scale down the molecular dynamics, this could correspond to simulations running for hundreds of femtoseconds, which is when most of the interesting ultra-fast stuff occurs. So we should be able to see experimentally the interesting stuff with existing systems. Errors also tend to be well behaved in analog simulations, right? So simulation will certainly drift from the truth as time goes on, it will drift further and further, but there tend to be no abrupt errors in analog simulation. So you don't, if you're doing digital simulation and you end up with a bit flip in your leading digit of your arithmetic, then you have a considerable problem. Another thing which I think nobody really understands very well, although Mohan Sarwar, who is, I think, present here, is the expert to ask, is that certain observables are surprisingly robust to certain kinds of noise. And I don't think I think this really is an open question for the field to have a robust theory of error in analog simulation. What observables can we simulate for long times under certain kinds of noise? So for example, in the simulations that we've run, the fidelity of your simulation might be very poor, but your absorption spectrum or something might be very accurate nevertheless. And another point is that noise can actually be useful in simulation here, and it can actually simulate an open quantum system. So these are, like I said, are both more chemically relevant because they simulate what's happening in the condensed phase, and they're harder to simulate classically. So actually, running an imperfect analog simulation can be an advantage if you're looking to find, useful quantum simulations. All right, so where are we in terms of a practical quantum advantage? What dynamical calculation is beyond the reach of classical computers? This is a complicated question, and I don't kind of want to get sucked into the same situation that Google was in when they were saying this is impossible classically. But for conventional simulations of full dynamics, the limit is about 5 modes, which means that you'll be able to go beyond it with 6 motional modes, and that would require only 3 trapped ions, something that's well within existing possibilities. For MCTDH, the limit is a bit more complicated, but we're talking about tens of modes for difficult systems. And dissipation is our friend here. Dissipation makes classical simulations harder, makes quantum simulations easier. And so that's why I think that first useful simulations will likely be of weakly dissipative non-adiabatic dynamics. And so in conclusion, and by the way, this is a trapped ion from our friends in the Quantum Control Lab, Mike Biersug's group, where we are trying to implement some of these ideas. The conclusions that I want to make are that chemical dynamics can be simulated on analog quantum computers using one-to-one mappings, very straightforward, of vibronic coupling Hamiltonians onto mixed qubit boson simulators. And this model is extendable. So we can have many states, many modes, open systems, complicated observables, whatever you want. And it should be achievable with existing quantum technology. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank my coworkers again, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan, for a nice talk. I think Tom has a question. Please go ahead, Tom, and ask.
So I had two questions, and I think the one on noise you answered. I guess my other question though is, you've said that we need to set up a bunch of, maybe additional hardware or like tailored hardware to simulate a specific molecule. If I set this up for one molecule and then I want to change it and study another problem, how easy is it to change this around? Does this actually need to adjust the system in the lab? Or is it something that can be changed just by changing, like in the control software, like changing the pulse scheme?
That's right. Yeah, and it's all about control schemes here. So you can, if you want to have a different vibrational frequency in your molecule, you just change the frequency of your acoustic modulator that's changing your laser frequency. And you can change the intensity of the lasers to model different strength couplings. And this really is the advantage of doing these kinds of things on the quantum simulator rather than in the lab, where if you wanted to study a different molecule, you need to rekit all of your lasers and everything else.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? So I have a quick question. Do you take into account the fact that do you exploit the fact that there's many levels available in the trapped ion outside this, what you would call qubits normally? Do you use those? I think I missed that part.
It's right. So we're using the vibrational levels in the sense.
Right.
In principle, we could use the different electronic states as well. And the way that we're a theory group, and so this paper is a theory paper, and it talks about kind of generic qubits as opposed to qubits. And it's a question of how many electronic levels do you have. In most chemical processes, only the several low-lying electronic states are important. And so that would correspond to using a qubit with, a few energy levels. So this is where it might matter. If you need to have more qubits, you might need to switch out to a different ion or come up with a different level scheme. But in principle, yes. And they're also important for readout of some observables.
Okay, great. Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you very much for having me.